The Talk Station presents Faith Matters, a look at contemporary stories and issues from a faith perspective. While this is a pre-recorded show, we are interested in your ideas, comments, and questions, and we urge you to email them to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life.
And now, your host for Faith Matters, Ben Ball.
And welcome to the program here for this week here on Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And joining us once again today is Reverend Robert Cornegy from Chapel by the Sea in Emerald Isle, and also Dr. Ron Monteperto from Carteret Community College, and also Reverend Mark Woods from Cherry Point United Methodist Church. Hello, folks.
Good afternoon.
Hey, Ben.
Good, everybody. We're recording in a little bit different time here today, so we got some things to talk about relevant to this week and this past week as well. And then the news out this past week that Fred Phelps, who led a what is I reluctantly call a church, a Westboro Baptist Church. It is the one that was most famous for protesting funerals of military dead soldiers, as they would proclaim that God was happy they were dead because of America's stance on homosexuality. It's sort of hard to even speak about the sort of convoluted idea that he professed and this church professed. But they would stand out with their very famous signs in funerals or in front, as they did at Camp Lejeune, in front of the gates and protest there, and really drew a lot of attention. And here he has passed away. This sort of his sons say that this church goes on. So, Ron, is this an anomaly in sort of political, religious speak to see this kind of thing, or is this sort of very fringe expression of Christianity mixed with politics has been out there?
I think this is a very, very fringe expression and a complete reversal of what I understand to be Christianity. That really doesn't have any political clout either. It's so unusual, it's so bizarre that it gets a lot of attention. But I don't think that anyone I think that very, very few people, an insignificant number of people, are influenced in any political way by anything that he did. I dare say that more people who were by no means in favor of homosexuality were appalled at the things that he said, and by the spurious linkages that he made, and I think that probably it's probably not worth all the attention it's getting, actually.
You know, before we started this and we were talking about doing this subject, Mark, you made an interesting comment too about what some of the folks or the alliances, the unusual bedfellows, made from the speech of this Westboro folks.
Yeah, definitely. I read a particular article. I can't remember where it comes from. It was this past week, and it was kind of put out by somebody who you would think would be sort of against Westboro Baptist Church. They were very pro-LGBT, and yet they were saying that he had done so much for the LGBT community by taking people who normally wouldn't be on their side, would end up being on their side because they didn't want to be associated with Westboro Baptist Church. Does that make sense? So it was kind of like he actually did a lot to help strengthen the LGBT community by being so abrasive that even people who might not agree with homosexuality, which I think is kind of what Ron said, would actually distance themselves from Westboro Baptist Church and be sympathetic to LGBT community because of the strong rhetoric that Westboro Baptist Church would use. And this is not, I don't think this is uncommon. I mean, I definitely think certain ideologies or certain ways of thinking often contain within themselves their opposite. Here's an example. This is a very good example, I think, of the sense of I think now kind of ideologically, philosophically, it's very popular to be tolerant, to be pluralistic, to kind of be like everybody's okay. Truth is sort of relative on some level. And so what that kind of contains in it is its opposite, a kind of hatred, a kind of no, we don't want everyone to be okay. There are some who are not okay. And Westboro Baptist Church kind of was a reaction, I think, to a more extreme tolerance, extreme kind of pluralism. Does that make sense? So oftentimes what you're intending, the opposite will come from that.
Robert, I think I was just looking at an article by Leonard Pitts Jr., who writes a lot of sometimes funny, some political, satirical things, and he says in his subheading of "The Wasted Life of Fred Phelps," is his title for his essay in the Baltimore Sun, says Phelps was given the gift, the incandescent miracle of being alive in this world for over 80 years, and he wasted it utterly.
Yeah, and that's so. And, the proof's in the pudding. I mean, this guy had the ability to, when you think of the convergence of the people that were against him, we're talking about the Ku Klux Klan, the Hells Angels, and homosexual activists were all on the side against this guy. When is that gonna happen?
Yes.
I mean, that's how extreme his approach was. And I've been reading a little bit about how they approached it. He began basically with celebrities and about the anti-homosexual side of it and God's scorn and punishment. And then when he moved to the military, that was when it started changing.
It started to attract much more attention.
Yeah, exactly, and he got in the media and all of that. So yeah, isn't it sad that for some people, when they think of Christianity, they're gonna include this guy in their thinking, which he was anything but.
Well, and on that point, one of, I think, the fears of many, and I think it's well founded, is that people who either are not Christians or people who are not Americans, actually looking in on this country from other places, they see something like that as being an official line. I mean, this is what Christianity thinks. They may see that. I mean, they may see that, or the burning of the Koran, or they may see other expressions. I mean, he was known as the God hates guy. God hates China. God hates media. He had various signs, and of course, he used a derogatory term for people's sexual preference, and he used that as their that was their website was called that.
Yeah.
This was something that people worldwide knew who he was. Kind of amazing. We all cringed. I think I cringed every time, like I'm doing now, every time we brought it up, either in a discussion or in a news article or something, when they came to town and protested.
Mm-hmm. That's the bit about free speech that people just don't understand. If they're not from a place that has free speech like we claim we have, in 2011, the Supreme Court upheld the decision 8-1 that he could do this stuff. And Chief Justice Roberts said, given that Westboro's speech was at a public place on a matter of public concern, that speech is entitled to special protection under the First Amendment. Such speech cannot be restricted simply because it is upsetting or arouses contempt.
I know you spent time in China and some of those areas, Ron, and I know my dad used to spend time in Japan. He would say that there was always this idea that he wasn't just representing his company, but he was an American.
Well, people abroad, particularly in Asia, tend to take individuals as representatives of their countries. When we lived in Japan, my sons both went to a Japanese school, and the whole point of what was very interesting, their teachers would tell their Japanese students, you've really got to behave in the presence of these Americans to show them just how well behaved we are and everything else. And so my sons rapidly got onto the idea that they were representing all Americans. And it made for a very interesting year of discipline.
Yes, I would
In
imagine.
fact, it made things a lot easier. So that is the case. I think we're being too hard on ourselves. The people from abroad who say, this is what Christianity represents, they're just off the beam about Christianity to begin with, and for them, this is just one more extreme confirmation of all the misconceptions they already have. And I really don't think that it does. I guess I just don't think it does. It has a negative impact in that respect. Also, I think that we in this country and Christianity in this country is far bigger. Is far big enough to contain,
To handle speech.
to handle this to handle this kind of thing. And it's, I mean, one does not, because one does not like this man or what he says, does not mean that one is in favor of the things that he stands against.
Right.
And I
Right.
think that is clear.
I agree with you, Ron. And yet, this was birthed. Westboro Baptist Church, that whole movement was birthed out of American Christianity on some level. Like, I'm not saying we agree, but we might have to take some responsibility for the sins of our own kind of lack of understanding in Christianity. And this, I think, is one of those lacks of understanding.
Well, we'll see how that settles in with the rest of us here. In just a moment, I see some shaking of heads already.
I got to keep it lively, right?
More to come in a moment on Faith Matters on the Talk Station. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240, and I'm Ben Ball, and along with Dr. Ron Monteperto, Reverend Mark Woods, and Reverend Robert Carnegie with us today as we talk about matters of faith in the world. And in this week, in fact, it should have happened, we're recording on Tuesday, it should happen on Thursday, when President Barack Obama will meet with Pope Francis. But this week, we have the news story out about Pope Francis making some appointments to a commission that he promised to create to look into the idea of sex abuse, and a special commission there, too. And this is from the Associated Press from Vatican City. It says, Pope Francis named the initial members of a commission to advise him on sex abuse policy on Saturday, signaling an openness to reach beyond church officials to plot the commission's course and priorities. Among those who were named to this commission, half of the members are women. One was assaulted by a priest as a child. The 8 members were announced after Francis came under fire from victims' groups for a perceived lack of attention to the abuse scandal, which has seriously damaged the Catholic Church's reputation around the world and cost dioceses and religious orders billions of dollars in legal fees and settlements. Now, again, this stretches back a long prior to Pope Francis. But this is does this strike you, Ron, let me start with you. Does this strike you as this is a tone from Pope Francis that we almost have come to expect now, that he will act, and he will act in a way that may surprise people?
It does. It doesn't surprise me anymore.
You're not surprised any longer. The veil is off.
Which is exactly your point.
Yeah.
I think he has succeeded in establishing a climate and a general approach to things. I think he's very interested in collegiality, and I think he is sensitive enough to understand that inputs from laity and just sort of ordinary people are very important if the church is to respond to is to formulate its policies in ways that are appropriate for this day and age, and yet still retain some semblance of traditional order and approaches. And it's just common sense that you ought to have someone like this. And it's a commentary that we have to even comment about it. You see,
yes.
It speaks volumes about what the church has been through and where it's put itself. And here's something that really ought to be really quite ordinary and taken for granted, gets headlines. I find that interesting. I'm very glad that he's done what he's done, and I think it is typical of his approach. And we're going to see more stuff, and we're going to see a lot more like this.
And Mark also included in the statement from the Vatican that the Commission would look into both civil and canonical duties and responsibilities. The idea of civil responsibilities has been, I think some would say, anyway, that has been vacant from some of the responses in the past.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that those who are pushing for the church to do more don't just want them to do it in a kind of ecclesiastical context. They want a civil context. They want the law to be involved in the sense that bishops aren't just taking care of their priests and disciplining their priests, but they're working with law enforcement as well, reporting priests for law enforcement. So I think that those words were chosen very, very carefully, I think, by the Vatican, that this might be actually what they're doing. And if you look at who was appointed as well, it's not just theologians. There are some theologians on there. There's moral theologians, but there's child and adolescent psychiatrists. There are constitutional lawyers. A couple of lawyers, actually, I believe, are appointed on this thing. So I think it seems to be that in the appointments, not only is it just that we're overjoyed that it's women, but it's who is appointed there that could make the connection between the ecclesiastical law and kind of more state law.
Robert, you can see that this is interesting here where the church may have walled themselves off more from civil society and civil sanction in the past, that Pope Francis here is reaching out in a way that sometimes the civil society doesn't. But it is reaching out to the non-Catholic world here and saying that we live in this community too.
I don't know that he's going outside the Catholic world. I think all the people on the panel are Catholics.
Oh yeah.
But I think what he's doing, he's not going to the state. He's not going to other power principles, if you will. He's going to experts in these areas, and he has found experts in these areas that are both gender, and it's a balance, as I understand it. It's a balanced, gender balanced board. Which and of course, we tend to think more of the abuses were in both genders, so
right.
It's appropriate that everyone involved in this is going to be on both sides of that issue. But I don't think he's going outside the church. I think he's looking within the body of Christ for counsel, and this is an advisory board.
Right.
This is not a decision-making board. He
Advisory
hasn't delegated any authority, but he is seeking advice from them in the process.
I think what's different here is that this advisory board is also advising on discipline, on what kind of tracks of discipline they would follow.
Yeah, there was a little bit of discussion about how far they were going to go into that,
right.
But that it looked like they could be going into that. But a lot hasn't been released yet. This is kind of the opening step of getting the information out. That they announced this back in December it was going to happen, and now they're actually doing it. So that's positive step.
Is this Ron a continuation? Really, I mean, Pope Benedict also defrocked, as the article states here, of 400 abusive priests in the last 2 years of his papacy.
Well, it's difficult in questions of this sort, but I think in 200 years from now, when someone writes the umpteenth volume of the history of the Church of Rome, they will look at this period in a much larger context, and I think that they will say that the papacy of Francis marked a time when all the various threads of how the problem should be dealt with, all the various approaches, were brought together and formulated in a systematic and orderly way, and then implemented. It's going to be generations before the church recovers from this.
But Mark, I think this is What was interesting, often the church's defense of priests in the past, not defending their actions, but defending their positions as creatures of God, that they needed ministry, and that a lot of times it seemed like the Holy See would defend their role in this as being, we are ministering to these wayward priests, even as we move them around, even as we move them somewhere else. And that was what I think raised concerns among the laity as well, especially. Is that?
Yeah, no doubt, because and you see that sort of it seems kind of secretive. You know what I mean, that they in that way, because we want and in any other kind of institution, it's a very public thing. It's a very the law deals with this. Federal law or state law or whatever deals with this kind of issue, and then for the church to kind of minister to their own seem to be incorrect on some level. And this is something that comes up not just in this thing, but all the time on this program, kind of still the relationship between church and state, and the relationship between the law. A lot of people...
The ecclesiastical argument and the legal argument.
That's exactly. I think that's right. And we see here in these two things, in this issue, those things kind of clashing.
Ron?
There's a larger, more traditional issue at work here, too, that has to be overcome, and I think which will die only very slowly. There is in Roman Catholicism, and probably in other branches of the church as well, this notion that a priest is someone set apart, that there's a special gift, which is called a vocation. It's hard to find words to explain it. But having been called, having received this call, it makes this person, and it's the church, in the case of the Church of Rome, this man, in some way different to other men, from other men, and not really responsible to civil law, because he is in the company of other men who have somehow been given a special grace or a special gift or something else. Now, there are all kinds of problems with that view, but I can say for certainty that that is the view that was held by many, many Catholics, which makes this whole scandal all the more poignant and makes it all the more difficult to bear. And so I think if you're coming at it from the point of view of Rome, the people, the bishops and the church leaders who had to deal with this issue, in fairness to them, were all hung up on this. It wasn't necessarily just selfish or self-serving. Is what they call the true vocation. Somehow this sets you apart from other people. Now, I guess I don't believe that, and I do believe in the true vocation.
Let me draw us back to our first segment just for a moment, because I only have a moment. But is that because we haven't really discussed the sex abuse scandal on this show? Really, we haven't given it a great much thought at all, or much discussion. But is this something there where we, as Christians, again, need to look inward and look and say, are there things that we overlooked or we looked past in our own faith that brings out sometimes these vile expressions of action? And I'll say, back to you, Mark, on just a couple of 30 seconds there to
No, I think that's
agree
right. I think that, and that's why we call it a kind of abuse. Because the real power that a priest had would be for service, not privilege.
Right.
But then
same
that
as a
power,
pastor.
Same as a pastor.
Fred Phelps was abusive.
That's
of
right.
Of his role.
That you are okay.
All right, and that wraps it up for this segment. More to come. Welcome back to Faith Matters here on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240, and thanks for making us part of your Sunday morning experience, and we're glad of that. Joining us, as always, on Faith Matters, I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Robert Cornegie, Reverend Mark Woods, and Dr. Ron Monteperto with us. And we're talking about items in the news and items that come to our attention, commentary as well, including one that comes from the American Baptist Press and also the Religious Herald in a combined blog that they write. And it's a piece by the managing editor of the Baptist Standard, Ken Camp, and it's called Osteen Illustrates Non-Denominalization of U.S. Religion, says church historian. He's referring to an historian named Bill Leonard. And the subheadline to this is Joel Osteen is either the future of American evangelism or an illustration of its captivity to a form of religion akin to American enterprise, more akin to American enterprise than Christian theology. Megachurch pastor Joel Osteen and Lakewood Church in Houston offer a high-profile case study in the non-denominalization of 21st century evangelical American religion, says church historian Bill Leonard. Osteen manages to be modern and postmodern, traditional and experimental in his approach to the church and the gospel itself, and his congregation may represent a bridge between how American evangelism has reached one generation and what it may become as it attempts to reach the next. You know, without, I guess, Robert, as the, how do you call it, not non-denominational, intradenominational church? Is trans-denominational you're talking about? Chapel by the Sea. But you draw a lot of people, though, from a lot of different backgrounds.
Yeah, we do.
And also, as an evangelist and Christian apologist, do you see anything... I mean, without it, I guess it's too often among pastors. It sounds like sour grapes sometimes.
Yeah.
But is there a sour grapes message here, or is this a valid criticism?
Yeah. Well, it's that Lord bless me with that curse.
Of drawing thousands of people.
Yeah. I mean, it is a phenomena of our time. It really is this new popularism of Christianity, and the Osteen phenomenon will be talked about, as I think we've mentioned in here, for generations, as he is sort of in between two worlds. The emerging church, which was a movement that began 10, 15 years ago, and it was for the seekers in our society, those that would had pretty much turned away from traditional religion, and yet they still wanted to have a spiritual experience. And so the emerging church sort of came and created a form that would allow them to have community and to kind of play around with the edges of faith for a while until they kind of dropped in or dropped out, one or the other. And then you've got the traditionalists that, want to go in and do it just the way mom and daddy did it and grandma did it and, faith of our fathers and all that stuff. And they want that sort of real fairly formal approach to their faith. And Osteen seems to be kind of in the middle of the two. He is unusual. He's drawing into both camps. So it'll be interesting to see. It's been said years ago, and this is decades old, that the church has moved out of the era of the big personality. I don't know if you heard those things going around, and that now church is about community and about coming together, and it's not so much following a personality; it's following the precepts of the Lord, and yet we have these celebrity pastors now, and Osteen's one of them, and there's several others, Driscoll and
Rick Warren.
Yeah, exactly, and they're still around. So it's interesting to see how that's continuing on.
Mark, what would you do if you were preaching in front of 20,000 people?
I won't. I probably will never have to face that, so that's fine. This is the brilliance, though, of people like Warren Osteen. And when I say brilliance, I mean that they have figured out how companies do well and said, why don't we just do that with church? I read a comment the other day where people were saying that church needs to be more like Disney on Facebook. And I cringed, obviously. And though I call them brilliant, I disagree on so many levels. But they have figured out how to market and to use that kind of business model of church in order to draw people in. I mean, that becomes kind of the focus. And so in that respect, being American Christians and being good, business savvy people, that's quite brilliant. I mean, it's quite brilliant.
Well, we talked just a few weeks ago about a church in downtown Durham, I think it was, or no, in Raleigh, that was also stuck to very traditional conservative policies and orthodox, as many would say, yet did it in a very savvy business model as well, keeping track of all the people and demographically savvy and social network savvy about that as well. Is this a new? But Ron, we've had evangelists and people who captured the attention of the American public probably in every generation, every decade. I mean, is it just a new forum? It's just a wider media now.
No, I think there's no such thing as to adopt the business model is to. I believe, as a social scientist and as someone who dabbles in philosophy around the edges and so on, the business model is a reality for a particular kind of thing. It's a social institution that works well for particular kinds of purposes, and there's relationship between its end and its purpose, or its organization in the way it operates. I would argue that by adopting a business model, or as we would say, a Weberian rational bureaucratic model of all of this, that somehow the ultimate purpose of God's truth is not necessarily the end of that, because the system is not set up to promote that truth. The system is set up to be a successful organization. And I think that there is a difference in that. And it's possible. Yeah. It's possible. There is a radical oneness in the presence of Jesus, and it's possible for all of us to come into that. But my argument with the Reverend Mr. Osteen is that he's there to achieve certain practical ends, and I think the need to achieve those practical ends influences the way in which he expresses in words and in organization the truth that he's supposedly called to. And I think in doing so, that changes it very dramatically.
This isn't a new phenomenon, what's going on here. We had talked about a little earlier about back when I was a kid, it was Norman Vincent Peale and his The Power of Positive Thinking. And he was a pastor out of a huge church in New York and very successful. And this was
before that, Billy Sunday.
But this was a very powerful message of I remember was sitting by the radio and listening to Norman Vincent Peale on the radio, and then it was Robert Schuller and the Crystal Cathedral, and now it's Joel Osteen, and there's this and I think they're all using kind of that same approach of and look, we are to, from Philippians, think on the good things, whatever is true, whatever is right, whatever is righteous. We are to think on these things, but there's much more to it. That's one aspect of a relationship with Christ, and it's not just thinking happy thoughts that gets us through life. And I think that is very attractive. It's a bright light that attracts a lot of creatures to the light, and it is light, but it's kind of a light as opposed to a dense light, right. If you know what I mean. Yeah. And so to be able to get into the more dense truths that are around that as well, that are involved, entwined in that, it requires another kind of commitment. And so, it'll be interesting to watch how this plays out as this goes on. I know he'll listen at some point in time, but let me just bring up one of our former compadres, Paul Stallsworth. And one of the things I liked about Paul a great deal, and he'll be humbled by this comparison, that I also like about Billy Graham, is that the message remains the same. It doesn't matter what size audience. I mean, I've seen him before 8 people at a Wednesday night communion service, and I think Billy Graham would have the same message in front of a half a dozen people that he would have in front of 20,000. And to your point, Ron, is that sometimes the mechanics of it
may alter what we emphasize as true. And Mark, would you agree?
I think this is the old debate between form and content.
Mm-hmm.
We like to think our content stays the same if we change the form, but that's just not the case. I just don't think we can say that if we change the form of something, that the content isn't somehow altered too. Those are two sides of the same coin, right? That was for you, Robert. If you change the form, the content will be altered in that, and I think the church has moved from being, some churches have moved from being preservers of a tradition, preservers of a particular kind of identity to a heritage, paying attention to history more, to being more entrepreneurial. What is the next new thing? What are we got to do in order to fill the seats? And I think Ron's point was very, very good. That that might falter the message on some level.
Once again, finishing up the segment there with Mark. And we'll have more to come in just a moment here on Faith Matters. You can be in touch with us, faithmatters@thetalkstation.com. Welcome back to Faith Matters on the Talk Station, FM 107 and AM 1240. And I'm Ben Ball, along with Reverend Mark Woods, Dr. Ron Montepero, and Reverend Robert Cornegie, as we talk about items in the news and also matters of faith. And this one is a little bit interesting and a little bit different for us as well. This is from Troy, New York, an AP story. After a sermon connecting the Christian values of America's founding fathers with the right to bear arms, an Upstate New York Baptist minister has raffled off a new Smith & Wesson M&P semi-automatic rifle. Other local ministers criticized Sunday's giveaway, but the Reverend John Coletis of Grace Baptist Church in Troy said that in an online letter that he wanted to honor gun owners who have been so viciously attacked by the anti-Christian socialist media and politicians. The Albany Times-Union reports that the winner was 42-year-old Ron Stafford of Schenectady, who will have to go through a background check before he gets the gun. Okay, that little story is actually let's throw this in the pot here. Is that in some ways we talked about things on a small stage versus things on a grand stage, and is that really all that different? Is this a stunting? Is this a something that will pull the people into the seats, and where do you feel about pastors maybe stunting? Mark, let me start over there with you, since you seemingly want to retreat from this story.
Yeah, definitely. This will not happen at Cherry Point United Methodist Church. I'm pretty sure, at least not while I'm there. I imagine. It's just fascinating to me that I definitely think you're right, Ben. I definitely think there's some stunt going on here. Obviously, you raffle to get people to come and do that kind of thing. There's some of that. What I found really fascinating was the quote on why he did it. Yes. It wasn't because raffling a gun would preach the gospel, because raffling a gun will bring people to Christ or anything like this.
Or even in the church, for that.
Or even in the church. It was as a reaction to the anti-Christian socialist media. And it just seems like...
that was a quote from him. Yes.
That's right. That was a quote. And that just seems like a gross misuse of a Sunday morning. Does that make sense? I mean, I think that there are ways in which the Christian faith does speak out against social media, does speak out against anti-Christian thing, and on some level moves against, individualism in our society. I would say instead of raffling a gun, you have communion or Holy Eucharist. Those are ways in which we react against those things.
You wouldn't get an AP story out of that.
Yeah, no, I would not get an AP story out of that. But I think there's two things going on here. One, I think you're right, Ben. This is a stunt, and two, I think that this is just gross misuse of Sunday service.
There will be, I think, some people, to use your two sides of the same coin, that will just comment on this as saying the same comment they might have about Joel Osteen, is that anything to get them in the seats.
Mm-hmm.
Ron?
It's funny that we should be having this whole program has been devoted to people who are on the edge in some way. In this particular case, I take this
I think
man.
Pope Francis would take that as a compliment.
Well, yes, actually.
Yeah.
But this man is, again, he has the same kind of mental, I should say, I sense a kind of imbalance and emotionalism about it that reminds me very much of the fellow at, was it Westview Church? Westboro Church. It's that same narrow focus, that screen through which he takes the Gospels, and we finally find ourselves honoring gun owners who have been attacked by anti-Christians. Now, because you believe in gun control, does that make you a bad Christian? And does a person like that have to be honored? I don't think any of those things follow. And I think the man needs to have some work done with his thought process, to put it as politely as I can.
It's fascinating, isn't it? When this was more than a.
But he also tied it into founding fathers there,
he did.
too.
He absolutely did. And look, I have to admit, I am one who likes special effects from the pulpit. I had a friend who once years ago who had he was a magician, a Christian magician, and for kids and all of that. And he had a Bible that when you opened the Bible, it would explode. There'd be a little smoke and a bang and all this stuff. And so in one service,
you really got Mark going.
I brought out my little special effect, and let that thing go off. And that was probably 25 years ago. And to this day, I still get comments on that smoking Bible that I pulled out.
But do they remember the
how
message?
do we illustrate our sermons is I think the topic of this discussion. This was a sermon illustration gone to the extreme where you actually in the service, and I'm assuming that's what happened.
Yeah.
He gave the message, and after the message, he literally raffled off this gun. And now, look, I'm come from a gun culture. Hunting's a big thing down here. We've actually at our church we recently had a clam chowder cook-off and silent auction. And one of the items we silent auctioned off was a bird hunting gun, a shotgun, a 12-gauge shotgun, pump shotgun. And so that's part of the culture in this area. Now, I'm not defending this guy's doing. We didn't do it on Sunday morning. We did it on Saturday night
from the pulpit,
which was different. We didn't do it from the pulpit, but this was a gimmick, and he needed to talk to the. He may have talked to the elders before he went and did this thing. I'm not sure, but they were probably in on it. I don't know. I don't know anything about Troy. What's Troy like? Is it a gun country?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, is that right? Upstate hunting and all that stuff. Yeah. Heard a fascinating story the other day.
By the way, the winner had to drive half an hour to get there.
That's right.
From Schenectady to Troy. I was just looking it up just for grins. I wanted to find it's 27 miles.
Yeah.
How many of our parishioners are driving 27 miles to our church?
Not many.
It was fascinating. The other night they were interviewing Justice Kagan. I don't know if you saw this on C-SPAN. And somebody brought up the question about what was confirmation like. She said the hardest thing was when they started talking about guns. She said, because I'm from New York City, I don't know anything about guns. I had never been in the presence of a gun. I'd never, touched a gun. I didn't know anything about it. And so she was sharing this with Justice Scalia. How do you say it? Scalia. Yeah. And Justice Scalia said, well, let's go hunting. And so she said, okay, let's go. And so they went, and this is a true story. They went to a range and they did some practice, got her accustomed to the weapon, and then they went out and did some rabbit hunting and stuff like that. And then he took her to Wyoming or Montana or someplace, and they went deer hunting. and she shot a deer. And she's sitting in Georgetown University in front of all the students sitting there in Georgetown, and says, it was kind of fun. And it was just a hilarious moment as she makes this arc from being absolutely no information about guns to actually seeing the reality of the gun culture.
Yeah. Well, it is. That's a great story. And the thing here actually will relate probably more next week, because there are discussions under their cloaks, and it happened in their discussion rooms will be coming up next week because of the cases that are before the court as we are discussing this right now. They're making those oral arguments, but this is again back to the idea of, do you do whatever it takes to get people into the church, and exactly where does that go and what does that lead to? Ron, you've experienced a lot of, you've been to a lot of different churches all over the world and probably seen lots of different practices that may have been normal but unusual to you, but normal to other people. And so where do you stand on a stunt?
Where I stand on
perhaps?
this is that when you start beginning to ask people, when you start structuring things to fill the pews, to bring people in, to be relevant at all costs, that marks the beginning of the end for any kind of church. That's where I personally stand on this. I believe there's a core, and you can do and anything that in any way, everything we do in church should focus on that core. And the minute you start cutting corners or taking this out because it'll offend some people, or put this in because it'll bring in more people, then you get all tied up in a whole range of other social issues that take us nowhere, and I think they're terribly dangerous. Yeah.
Mark?
Pastors feel this, Ron. You're exactly right. Pastors feel this pressure. We have to fill, I know as Methodists, I fill out the attendance every single week to keep track of it, because I know quarterly I'm going to have to report my attendance, and that's the first questions they asked. What is your average weekly attendance? And you're constantly bombarded as a pastor with, well, if you just do this, you'll get more people in your pews.
Right.
And it's a real danger, I think, for a lot of pastors.
I will say, though, and this is a confession, is that we had above average attendance last Sunday, pretty strong, in fact, and I felt more energized by that. So there's a ministry that goes in reverse as well, but we weren't stunting and giving away shotguns at the time either. Thanks for joining us today on Faith Matters.
Thank you for joining us for Faith Matters. Email your comments, questions, and suggestions to faithmatters@thetalkstation.com.
Give me faith, trust what you say, that you're good and your love is great. I'm broken inside, I give you my life. Give me faith.
Faith Matters is a production of The Talk Station.